Last week I talked about three strands of production history in which the creation and use of recorded musical material was a starting point for a creative production process. The examples I used for those three strands were Miles Davis' Bitches Brew album, King Tubby's dub techniques, and the beat juggling and sample culture of the early hip-hop artists like Public Enemy. I explained how these three strands, the first of them in particular, had been a strong influence in the decisions I made about my forthcoming album, for Failing Upwards. This week I want to talk about another aspect of the Bitches Brew album and the way that the working methods can have a powerful impact on the musical energy of a recorded performance. So first we're going to go back into the history of production again and talk about the changes in studio design during the 1960s and 70s. Usually this is discussed in terms of the way that acoustic treatments and isolation but I want to think about this as a working environment. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, recording studios were treated by record companies as sites of industrial production. Sound engineers wore the white and brown coats of laboratory or factory workers. Musicians were required to come in and out as quickly as possible. And then in the 1960s and 70s, musicians, pop and rock musicians anyway, started to think of recording as a creative artistic process in its own right. Songs started to be written and arranged in the studio, and they spent more and more time there. Studio complexes started to adapt to reflect this change in working practices. Control rooms got bigger and more comfortable. Recreation rooms were added instead of the canteens. Artists spent longer and longer in the studio, and the attention paid to recordings became more meticulous. In the 1920s, we can find examples of records that were released with huge mistakes on them because jazz and popular music records were considered throwaway items. They could be listened to a few times and then you buy the next one. Even in the 1960s and 70s, it was not uncommon to find small mistakes or imperfections on records. The cell sync system of independent tape head switching, invented in the 1950s, allowed the overdubbing of tracks on a multi-track tape system. At first, this meant that you could record the entire rhythm track on one take and then overdub an entire vocal track. There was no dropping in. Once the notion of dropping in did develop, you had to have a sufficiently long moment of silence in the recorded material to allow the tape head to engage, so drop-ins tended to be for a whole verse or a whole chorus rather than for a single line or even a single word. As the technology improved, drop-ins became more and more inaudible and recorded takes could be created in a much more fragmented way. This was combined with the notion of comping, recording multiple takes and bouncing together different segments from each one to create the perfect composite. In the classical and jazz worlds, where players still preferred to play together without overdubbing, this was done with tape splicing. Of course, once the digital audio station took over, this could be done with cutting and pasting on the computer. So, since the introduction of the cell sync system and multi-track recording, there's been a continual lengthening of the amount of time and care that musicians can put into perfecting their recorded performances. In the classical world, this has led to musicians and critics complaining that this cult of perfection has taken the life out of recorded performances. I remember a classical producer and small label owner at the 2006 Art of Record Production conference telling me that there was on average an edit every 2 seconds in their classical releases. An interesting parallel to this tension between what we can think of as two opposing forces of players not playing with the same energy in the studio as they do live, so being too relaxed, or performers getting red light fear at the thought of recording something that will represent them forever, being too nervous. Producers have different strategies for dealing with these problems. Grammy-winning producer Mike Howlett told me a couple of stories about how he calms the nerves of performers, from building a vocal booth out of rugs from her home and lit with scented candles for Joe Nama Trading, to his advice about recording some lead vocals every day in a session to get the vocalist relaxed and familiar with both the track and the environment. Robin Miller, on the other hand, talked about going into the recording space to stand next to a vocalist and trying to hype the energy up during takes. There are a few famous stories about putting musicians on edge, getting them out of their comfort zone to encourage more energy and excitement in their performances. Norman Whitfield, one of the famous Motown producers, got the band to play the backing track for Heard It Through the Grapevine a tone higher than Marvin Gaye had expected, to get a more energetic performance out of him. Bob Rock, as Metallica's producer on the Black Album, famously goaded Kirk Hammett into producing a suitable solo on the track Unforgiven by dismissing some of his earlier attempts by saying he hadn't done his homework and then demanding, "Let's hear the guitar solo of the year." So I mentioned another aspect of the making of the Bitches Brew album that helped me in my approach to my album, Failing Upwards. You've been hearing a special instrumental mix of one of the tracks, Back of My Tights, in the background of this video, and the album release starts in January 2023, with a video track released every week for 12 weeks. As you can see from the session timings coming up on the screen, the musicians on the album were recorded in ones and twos, and we recorded them in a very short period of time. Not everyone played on every track. In fact, only the drummers, Jas Kayser and Winston Clifford, and myself played on all the tracks. But as you can see, the average amount of time that each instrument spent on a track was between 30 and 45 minutes. Given that none of them had played or rehearsed the tunes before we went into the studios, this is an incredibly short amount of time. Apart from Kiamfu Kasongo, who plays mostly Congolese guitar music, all of the players are primarily jazz musicians, and so given that the songs span a range of popular music styles, none of them were in their comfort zone, although all of them are incredibly skilled players who are used to improvising and responding to musical stimuli. At the time that Miles Davis recorded Bitches Brew in 1969, he'd been developing an approach to studio work over a number of years that was quite unusual. In 1959, he'd recorded Kind of Blue with a quintet that he'd worked with quite a lot, but improvising the album from ideas that they hadn't worked on before they arrived in the studio that day. Almost the whole album was recorded on the first takes of entirely new material. In the decade that followed, Davis started to treat studio recording differently to his live work. While he generally had a regular band for live work, including what became known as the Second Great Quintet, he started to use the process of selecting musicians for recording dates as a way of creatively managing the recorded results, and was particularly interested in taking musicians out of their comfort zone to get extraordinary performances out of them. Towards the end of the 1960s, he started crediting himself on the albums as Directions in Music by Miles Davis, because, as he said in his biography, he was fed up with other white men taking credit for producing his albums. Just before he made Bitches Brew, he started to experiment with using editing as a creative tool in the recording process. Of course, tape splicing had been long used to compile takes of tracks from multiple performances, but it was mostly used to edit together the best takes of various performances of the same thing. But the most unusual aspect of the Bitches Brew sessions, a technique that, as I've mentioned, Davis had been slowly developing during recordings such as Circling the Round and In a Silent Way during the 60s, was his decision to record the album in multiple short sections with a view to editing them together. Davis was also looking to push the performers outside of their comfort zone by using very vague sketches of ideas as cues for creating composition through a process of group improvisation. In his biography he says, and I'm quoting, "So I would direct like a conductor once we started to play, and I would either write down some music for somebody or I'd tell them different things to play I was hearing as the music was growing. While the music was developing, I would hear something that I thought could be extended or cut back, so that recording was a development of the creative process, a living composition. Sometimes instead of just letting the tape run, I'd tell Tio to back it up so I could hear what we'd done. If I wanted something else on a certain spot, I would just bring the musician in and we would just do it." So, although I have quite extensive access to the great studios at the University of West London, I wanted to make sure that all the musicians were paid, and so I had to restrict the time. The recordings happened during various levels of the COVID lockdowns, and musicians' income streams had dried up when venues had to close, so I was financing the recording myself out of my salary as an academic, and so my budget was quite constrained and limited, and I decided to embrace that restriction and turn it into a feature of the production process. Apart from my vocal sessions and Wells Gordon, who was also a salaried academic and was working with me via the internet, everyone else came in for just short sessions where we had around 4 hours to record everything we needed. I had the two drummers in the studio at the same time, and we had 2 4-hour sessions to record all 12 tracks with them. The guitar, bass and piano were each done in a single 4-hour session, the sax and trumpet were recorded together in a 6-hour session, and the violin and viola tracks were done in around 3 hours. The aim was not to record entire versions of each track, but to record enough material to edit one together. The sound world of the album is quite an improvised and jazzy nature, so I wanted enough material so that they'd sound like continual performances rather than edited loops or short sections. I also was directing the players in the same room as they were playing rather than via talkback from a control room to make sure I got all the parts, textures and dynamic variations that I needed for the album. Of course, because they were improvising parts based on the demo tracks they were hearing in the headphones, the specific ideas I had about arrangements and textures were changing all the time as I heard new parts being played and I could do interesting things with them. And for me, one of the most important aspects of the album is the way that this working method of moving fast from track to track and also from idea to idea within a track, of responding to the musicality of these great players, sometimes going with the ideas that they came up with and sometimes guiding them in different directions when I wasn't quite sure that I was getting what I wanted. One of the most important aspects of this was the energy it produced. With these short sessions, we didn't have a great deal of time to work on the intricate details of the sounds, so I went for simple, well-tried microphone or DI techniques that I could set up in a few minutes, and then we worked really fast. Musicians in general who chose lo-fi recordings often say that they want to keep the technology out of the way to capture the live energy of them playing together. And then in this instance, I was trying to generate and capture a live energy with just 1 or 2 musicians at a time by talking to them about their creative input, asking them to put in their own ideas and to respond to mine. And I was very pleased and excited by the results. Of course, I knew I'd chosen great musicians. They were all people I'd either worked with before or heard them play, but the enthusiasm and energy that came out of each of these sessions was a direct result of this combination of working under time pressure and involving them in the creative process. So just a reminder now, I'll be creating one of these videos a week, reflecting on record production through the twin lenses of producing this album, Failing Upwards, and talking about the history of production. And on a final point, these sessions, trying to make sure I had everything I needed recorded for a future editing process, also point to the theme of next week's video, active listening. What do I mean by active listening? Tune in next week.